What is the root of all sin? Part 2. So the other day I made a video arguing that the root of all sin is not lust, it's not greed, it's not pride, it's not all the things that we commonly associate to the root, but rather the root of all sin is actually not trusting God. And most of the things that are commonly attributed as the root of sin are actually just outworkings of not trusting God. And of course, I saw a number of people arguing for other angles, pride, desire, selfishness, money, and I even had one person argue that it was knowledge, which is an interesting one, and I'll get to that. But because there's so many conflicting viewpoints on this, I wanted to take a moment to take and show how all of these actually find their root in not trusting God. Now, to do that, we need to do a couple of things. The first thing is we need to look at where did sin enter the world? Because where sin found its first intersection with humanity is the root, and that's where everything else grew from. And so we need to identify the exact moment that sin and humanity came into contact with one another. Now in Romans, it says that sin entered the world through the one man, and we know that that man is referring to Adam. So if we want to identify where and how sin entered into the world, we simply need to go back to Genesis and look at the interaction with Adam and Eve. And since we're trying to get to the root cause of sin, we more specifically need to look at their motivations. Why did they choose to sin? Because in their motivation is where we discovered the root cause of sin that was transferred to all of us through our DNA. Now, I already made the argument in my other video why I believe that them distrusting God was the motivation. So instead, let's now take each of the primary motivators that everybody brought up: money, pride, selfishness, desire, and knowledge, and let's evaluate whether or not those actually make sense in the context of Adam and Eve, and whether it's possible for those things to precede sin, or whether those things are an outcome of sin. So let's start with money, because this is honestly the easiest one. Saw a number of people quoted that the root of all evil is the love of money. Now, there are a number of ways that we could chop this one up, but I think the simplest way to look at it is that money didn't exist in the Garden of Eden. And even if you wanted to take the position that when he says money, he's actually talking about the spirit of mammon, which is a whole other issue regarding provision, that wouldn't make sense in that environment either, because they were already fully provided for in every possible way. And as far as we know, the spirit of mammon was not in the garden or active in the garden in any way, because sin had not yet entered the world. And lastly, by definition, evil is actually an outcome of sin, because sin is lawlessness and evil is the result of lawlessness. And since we know that the result can't precede the cause, this wouldn't work in this context outside of all the other things that I just mentioned. So next, let's look at pride, because I think pride probably has the strongest argument outside of maybe desire. Now, the reason that pride has such a compelling case is because much of what we read in Scripture seems to indicate that Satan's fall was due to pride. And so you could infer that pride at least existed in the world, because Satan was in the world and had fallen at that point in time as a result of pride. So to unpack this, we first need to define pride. What is pride? By definition, if we're using a biblical definition, pride is basically a haughty attitude or a perspective of oneself as being superior to others, which could also include God. And the difference between pride and truth is that pride is an overinflated view of yourself, whereas truth is an accurate view. So when God says that I am above all things, I am the single source of good, I am the greatest of all things, that's not pride speaking, that's just a statement of fact. In the same way, when Satan says, I know better than God, and God says, no, you're wrong, I know better than you, in that situation, if both parties were on equal footing, then you would say both parties are in their egos. But because God is who he is, and Satan is something that's been created, then in that moment, Satan is asserting an inflated view of himself, whereas God is stating a fact about himself. So the question becomes, is there anything in Scripture that seems to indicate that Adam and Eve had an inflated view of themselves or desired to have a conflated view of themselves? And I would say, based on the environment and the circumstances and what we know, that they were naked and unafraid, that they walked with the Lord on a regular basis, all of those things would suggest to me that pride was not an issue. If anything, they were naive, incredibly naive. But let's run with the assumption that maybe pride was there. Maybe, Adam was feeling a way about being less than God and, felt like he needed to somehow be at God's level. So let's just assume that motivation or that seed was already there. The issue is that it can't be the root of sin because Adam never acted on it until something very specific happened. Because remember, we said that it is the root cause. Okay, that means that it has to be the primary root catalyzing factor that caused sin to enter into the world. And we know that Adam and Eve walked with God for a period of time before ever eating of the fruit, and there was a very distinct moment that triggered them actually eating the fruit. And it wasn't pride. In fact, we know that it wasn't pride because it's very explicitly laid out in Scripture. It was the moment that Satan accused God of lying, and they didn't have an answer for it. Another way you could say this is at the very moment that Satan destabilized Adam and Eve's trust in God, whatever motives they had that might have led them to eat the fruit, leading up to that moment, it was only when Satan destabilized their confidence that God was being honest and truthful with them that they chose to eat the fruit. And so while pride is a compelling option, I still think it fails the test because up to that moment, there's nothing in Scripture that seems to indicate that there would have been a reason to have pride or anything to have pride in. And instead, it was the moment that trust was destabilized that actually triggered them entering into sin. And so even if pride was a factor, which I certainly think is possible, it definitely can't be the cause or the root cause, because if it had been, they wouldn't have required the destabilization of trust to act on it. Now, before I move on from this, there is one other angle that you could take here, and you could say, well, Satan didn't need to go through a destabilization of trust in God in order to come to the pride that caused him to fall, and so therefore that argument breaks. There's just one problem with that argument. Something had to have triggered Satan to fall, and we don't have a clear understanding of what that something is. We could say that it was pride, but if that pride had existed for whatever period of time, there had to have been a catalyzing moment where God did something that Satan basically disagreed with to such a degree that he felt like he had a strong enough case to say that you're wrong and I'm right. Basically, even if the pride existed, there had to be a moment where Satan crossed over the threshold of having the belief to then actually acting on it. And that rebellion, that act of rebellion, was triggered by something. And just in case there's any lingering doubts, I would also make the argument that the angels have a completely different basis of relationship with God than humans, because the angels were made as servants. And so the relationship with God is not a relationship of trust. They don't have to trust God. The expectation is that they serve God, they follow God, they obey God, because that is what servants are expected to do. Whereas the relationship with humans is a trust-based relationship. God's expectation is that we come to trust him. And so because of the difference in relational basis, I think that also is a contributing factor here that we have to pay attention to as well. Another way you could put it is that an angel's motivation for rebellion would be that I don't like you as a boss, whereas a human's reason for rebellion would be I don't trust you as a father or as a creator. And so even the fundamental basis of our relationship, I think, precludes pride, because in that relationship, pride would more likely come after the point that you felt that you couldn't trust the person that's supposed to take care of you, because pride then becomes a defense mechanism. Whereas if you're a servant and you already have that relationship with God and you have a full awareness of who he is and what his capabilities are and how he operates, and then you choose to rebel, in that situation, pride would make sense because it's a disagreement with the way that he's going about things and the belief that you could do it better. I know I labored that point a little bit, but because that's one of the most compelling, I wanted to make sure that we hit it from all angles. Okay, next we have to look at selfishness, which I actually think is an easy one, because if you boil selfishness down in its simplest form, it is self-interest. The interest of preserving or ensuring the maximum amount of self-interest that is available. Now, if you're Adam and Eve and you've been placed in a garden that is, by all accounts, perfect, and you're naked and not afraid, and you're walking with the literal creator of the universe, which at that moment in time, you don't have a frame of reference to believe that there might be something beyond him. So, for all you know, he is literally the source of all things. In that context, your self interest would be best served by staying in good standing with whoever that person is. And the only way one might conclude that deviating from that good standing would somehow better serve their self-interest is if at some point in time, the trust that they had in that particular being to have their best interest in mind was somehow destabilized. Because otherwise, your starting point is this being told me that they have my best interest in mind. All of my experiences that I've had seem to demonstrate that. And until somebody introduces a different idea or a different way of believing, you would have no reason to come up with something else. And even if you did, considering the consequences of death, you wouldn't just act on that. Like if your trust was destabilized because you came up with some, idea in your head that maybe he's not actually telling me what's good, which like psychologically doesn't make sense, but that's okay. Let's just pretend that somehow a person comes up with this on their own with zero input anywhere in their life that would suggest otherwise. The issue you run into is that logically you still wouldn't act on that, especially given the consequences of death, unless somebody presented you with evidence. Which leads us right back to the moment of Satan destabilizing Eve's trust by saying, God is lying to you, this will actually make you like God, and then you watch Eve go through the whole process of reasoning out and creating her own evidence to support the possibility that God may be lying to her, which I covered thoroughly in the last video, so go watch that if you want that context. And that, of course, leaves us with desire and knowledge. Now, the knowledge one is interesting. I didn't ask the person who listed knowledge, but my guess is that the way that they would argue that is Paul says it was the introduction of the law that made me know what sin was. And so the knowledge of sin is the thing that made it sinful. And so having knowledge, like the knowledge of good and evil, is the thing that actually introduced or became the root of sin. Which sounds like a good argument until you realize that the act of sinning is the thing that gave us the knowledge to be able to evaluate good and evil. And so the root of sin would have had to precede the acquisition of the knowledge. And so while it sounds good on paper, I still think it fails the test because, again, sequentially, you can't have the knowledge of good and evil without first sinning to get it. Which leaves us with desire, which I'll talk about in the next video because I just ran out of space.